Good morning. Welcome to St. Alphonsus Parish in this conversation about integrating your spirituality. My name is Father Tom Santa, and I'm the monitor of this conversation. And I really wanted it to be a conversation and not just me talking at you. I think there's so much material that's now available to us on the social media platform that has people talking at us. There's not so much an opportunity to engage in conversation with each other. And it's difficult to do that, but I'm hoping that with this platform that we have available to us, that at least through the questions and the comments that you can post before, during, and after the time we meet together each day, that can form the content of our time together. It also provides us with an opportunity to change the context of something, to explain deeper if something needs to be explained deeper, or to enter into a fuller explanation. Because admittedly, there's some things that I think, because I've talked about this subject for so many years, that I think everybody knows, but it might very well be new to you. And you might have a different reaction to it than I would assume. I know this is true because I remember a time, I hate to say it, over 25 years ago now, which I was giving a retreat with one of my friends, Philip St. Romain, at our retreat center in Wichita, Kansas at the time, and it was called the Spiritual Life Center. It still exists, the Spiritual Life Center, and it's an absolutely wonderful retreat center in Kansas. But at any rate, Philip and I were giving a retreat, and it was a retreat that we had well over 100 people at it. They were all members of St. Thomas Parish in Wichita, and they were all there not because they thought it was a good idea. They were there because their pastor thought it was a good idea. And so they had to show up in order to perform ministry. It was one of the conditions of their ministerial requirements for the year. So we had an audience that was not exactly open to discussing and paying attention to what we were trying to present. So it was a bit of a challenge. But at any rate, I distinctly remember that there was this man that was sitting in the back of the conference center, and he, from the minute we started that morning, he simply glared. And it never improved. He glared through every talk. He glared through every joke. He glared through the breaks. He glared the whole time. And I just kept saying to myself, oh my God, eventually this guy is just going to give it to us. And I thought that he was just upset because he had to be there, which shows you how much I know. Because it turned out he wasn't upset. It turns out, in fact, that what he was doing was listening. He was listening extremely intensely. And as a result of his intensity, I misread that as something that it was not. And at one time, he put his hand up, and I'll never forget this, because when his hand came up, Phil and I thought, well, here it comes. We're going to get it. And he said, you know, fathers, he said, you're talking about stuff I just really don't understand. I've never paid attention to spirituality before. I did all the things I was supposed to do in order to be confirmed, but once I got confirmed, that was graduation, and off I went. He said, I go to church, but he said, you know, basically I just sleep through the homilies, and I do what I'm supposed to do, and I contribute what I'm supposed to contribute. But he said, nothing ever grabbed me. Nothing ever got my attention. But he said, this morning when you guys started talking, there was something about what you were talking about that just made me come alive. He said, I began to feel within myself something that I didn't even know that was there. And he said, as the day has gone on, I've identified that as a thirstiness. And he said, it's a hunger for something I didn't even realize that I needed. And so I'm very, very grateful for this day. And I see it as a day of introduction. I see it as a day of invitation. So I think that all of us in our lives have moments like he had, perhaps not as dramatic, and certainly maybe moments that won't be used by me in a future retreat talk or conversation explaining what I saw and what I imagined. But I think all of us have moments when we recognize that there's something within us that needs to be paid attention to. There's something within us that needs to be tended to. There's an incompleteness that is there. And perhaps we don't even know what that incompleteness is or what the source of it is, but we just kind of sense that it's there. So my hope is that the conversation that we'll have these coming days, and none of us know how long this will last, but as long as it does last, to have a conversation about spirituality, and especially about integrating spirituality. Not talking about spirituality as a subject, or not talking about spirituality as a system, or not talking about spirituality as something that you acquire, or something that you merit, or any of those other words that we casually throw around. What I want to talk about is the human condition, the human person as a spiritual person. And I'd like to change it around just a little bit by quoting from Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist, a Jesuit, a philosopher, a cosmologist, a man well before his time, who in fact was silenced in his teaching during his lifetime because he was so far ahead of where everybody else was. It wasn't that he was intending to be far ahead. It was just because he had big thoughts, and he was willing to share those thoughts, and some people found them to be unhelpful. But one of the things that Teilhard said that I think is extremely important to ground our conversation this morning is that he said, we're not human beings having spiritual experiences. We're spiritual beings having human experiences. Now, that's not just a cute little saying. It's something that is worth pondering. It's something that's worth thinking about, and it is profound in its implications. And certainly as we continue our conversation over these next days, I hope that it's something that becomes true to you, that something that becomes an authentic expression of how you understand your place in the community, how you understand your place in the universe, that we are spiritual beings having human experiences. As Christians, that is essential to grasp and to hold on to ponder, to reflect upon, because Jesus became a human being. The entire message of the incarnation is that Jesus became human, like us in all things. And so the way to the Father, the way to the holiness of life, the way to integrating who we are, who we're meant to be, how we're formed, how we're created, is found in our humanity, but it's also found in our spirituality. It's not an either or, it's a both and. We're spiritual beings having human experiences. So human experiences are the ways that we encounter the divine. We encounter God. We encounter what gives us life, what gives us purpose. And it needs to be tended to. It needs to be something that's paid attention to. It needs to be something that's connected to. And that's what we're going to be talking about these days. How do I connect to that spiritual part of myself, integrate that spiritual part of myself that is essential to who I am as a human person? So we'll be talking about that. Who am I to be talking to you about these things? Well, I'm not an expert, believe me. I'm not even close to being an expert. In fact, I would say to you that anyone who claims that they're an expert, that's pretty much the first sign that they're not. Anyone who talks to you with absolute certitude about anything that has to do with spirituality probably doesn't know what they're talking about. Because certitude is not where it's at. So I'm not a person who is an expert. I'm not a person who is steeped in any particular system of theology. And for that, I'm grateful. I'm extremely grateful that I'm not steeped in any one system. I've dabbled in all sorts of systems, read all sorts of books, experienced all sorts of experiences along the way. And as a result of that, I think perhaps I've enjoyed a wider vision. Or maybe I'm just fooling myself. Maybe it would be better to just have a single point of view, a single system, if you will. But I don't think so. I think it's good to experience the fullness and the wonder of all of creation, of all of humanity, and in the process to experience the wonderfulness of the presence of God. So I'm not an expert. I have, as a person, been involved in the ministry of spiritual direction and teaching spirituality for about 25 years. And as I look at how I did that and how I encountered that experience of talking and teaching about spirituality, I mention this in an attempt, not because I think you need to know everything about me, but rather as an attempt to help put some of this, of what I'm going to share with you, into a wider context. I can see seismic shifts that occurred in my life, shifts that I never would have expected to be there. And to be perfectly honest, if I would have been given the opportunity to choose the experience or to follow the path, I probably would have declined. But I wasn't given a choice. It was something that I think I was led to. I have also been very blessed with having the experience of having some extremely good teachers, men and women who know what they're talking about and who are authentic in their teaching and in their sharing, who again do not present themselves in any way as an expert, but rather as people who are, if you will, companions, mentors, friends, someone that can point out the way. I say that there's been seismic shifts in my experience of what it means to be a spiritual person, and I would imagine there's been seismic shifts in your experience of what it means to be a spiritual person. You are not the same person that you were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You're not going to be the same person 10 years from now. And as a result of not being the same person, hopefully your spirituality will also change. The way that you understand the experience, the mystery of the presence of God will be different. I remember when I came out of the seminary back in 1978, I almost can't believe it was that long ago. But I came out of the seminary in 1978. I believed, and I think my entire class believed, that we were absolutely 100% prepared for what we were going to do. We had the best education possible. We were prepared by people who really knew what they were doing. And we entered into a system, into a church that was extremely confident in what they were doing. They were filled yet with the enthusiasm of Vatican II and the possibilities of Vatican II. And so it was an experience that was very heady. And you knew your place, and you knew what was expected of you, and you did it. That's what was the expectation, and that was, in fact, the reality. I look back on some of the things that I preached in those days, and I'm frankly embarrassed by them. Thankfully, the people of God have a sense of humor. They need a sense of humor, because some of the stuff that you hear, especially from the pulpit, and some of the stuff that I preach from the pulpit, is god-awful. But at the time, I didn't know it. I was confident that this was the way that it was, and I represented the system, the belief, absolutely perfectly. And I did that for quite a few years. Every once in a while, there'd be a crack in the confidence. Every once in a while, I would encounter something or someone that didn't fit. But I had an answer for that too. They just weren't open enough to God's creation. They weren't open enough to conversion. They weren't open enough to repent. It was always they weren't. It was never what I knew or what God was inviting me to do. It was always outside of myself rather than inside of myself. Again, like I said, I look upon those days, thankfully, with a sense of humor now. Not a sense of dread, but a sense of humor. And also a sense of profound respect. Because if God can work with me, then God can work with anyone. That's how I look at it. So anyways, when I first engaged in ministry and when I first engaged in spirituality, I did so with a great confidence. What I understand today is that I was not representing my spiritual self. It's hard even to say that. What I was representing was my religious self. I was representing the practices and the disciplines of a religious point of view, a profound religious point of view, the Roman Catholic Church. And there's much in the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church that is useful and helpful and life-giving. But God speaks in other ways too. And I wasn't really open to the fact that God speaks in other ways. I think the first crack, but I sealed it really quick, but nonetheless, the first crack in my certitude was when I journeyed to Japan. And I went there for no religious purpose. We did visit the Sisters of St. Joseph in Wichita, who had a beautiful convent right across the street from the famous Shinto Shrine, where the famous Zen garden is. And we went there and visited the Zen garden. But what really hit me in my visit to Japan was visiting the Shinto shrines, the Shinto places of worship. And I would enter into the Shinto shrine simply as a tourist. But I was struck by the piety. I was struck by the devotion. I was struck by the spirituality of the experience. It was impossible not to be invited into something deeper. And even though I didn't understand it, and even though I didn't appreciate it, really, it nonetheless had the effect on me. The other thing that happened in Japan was I learned that there's different ways of seeing the world and experiencing reality. And again, this happened as a tourist, not as a spiritual tourist, purely as a tourist. We were visiting many of the palaces and castles that make up the Japanese culture. And one of the things that I noticed was in every single room that we would enter, in palaces that had hundreds, if not thousands of rooms, they were distinctly different than anything I had ever experienced in my Western tradition and culture. If you enter into a palace in the West, it's filled with paintings and gold and furniture, and wealth just drips over everything. It's a sign, I suppose, of power and of authority. In Japan, you would enter into a room and it had a tulip. That's it, a tulip. Or it had a vase or a book, and that's it. Everything else was plain. Everything else was simple. Everything else was empty. And at first I struggled with what that might mean. But then I came to a realization and an appreciation of the simplicity of what it invited you into, what it said, what it claimed as a reality. When you're in a room in which the only thing that's in that room is a tulip, it's extremely hard to be distracted. You're forced to focus on the tulip. And in the process of looking at the tulip, you see something profoundly more than you can ever imagine. Again, like I said, it was something that cracked my certitude or challenged my understanding, but it certainly wasn't effective to change me in any way. I went back home and continued to do the same things and continued to do them over and over again. I would say that the place where my spiritual journey changed the most and where I began to experience something other than what I was taught happened in the desert. The Saguaro National Park, the desert in Tucson, Arizona, which has a completely different way of seeing, and I'm sure that will come out in the conversation as it progresses over the years, over the weeks ahead of us. But in the desert, you're invited into silence. The desert is very silent. It's very alive. It's very fruitful. It's all those things. But it's also very, very silent. And when you're faced with silence, silence invites you into something a little bit deeper. It invites you into something a little bit more. It invites you into something that perhaps, at least for me in my life, I had never experienced before. I had gone to many silent retreats. That was part of our religious formation. But those silent retreats were something that I endured. I disciplined myself to somehow get through the 8 days. But the silence didn't have any effect on me. The silence of the desert is a completely different type of silence. It's a silence that invites you each and every day, more and more profoundly, into an awareness, a growing awareness of something more, something bigger than yourself. The other thing that happens in the desert in the silence is the sky, the beauty of the universe that surrounds you. You can go outside and you can stand and you can see the universe. It's hard to see the universe in large metropolitan cities. But in the silence of the desert, the stars look like they're just going to be something that you can reach out and touch. I remember one night I was driving on an old country road. I was coming back from Phoenix, and I decided to take a back road, which was actually quite foolish. One should never take a back road in the desert, especially when you're all by yourself, but I did. And as I was driving, all of a sudden the moon appeared on the highway, and the moon was literally over the highway. It was huge. It kind of looked like the picture in E.T., where you see E.T. going across the sky. The moon was that large, and it literally sat there above the highway, and I was literally driving into the moon. And it was so overpowering, I had to stop the car and just look at it. I didn't know I had never experienced anything like that before. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't even know it was possible. But there it was. And in that experience, I realized, not in a scary way, though I would have thought it would have been a scary way, not in a scary way, I realized how small I was, how insignificant I was. And I realized that there was nothing that I could do. Everything that I had, everything that I was experiencing, everything that I understood about what it meant to be a human person, all of that came as a gift from God. And it was impossible to come up with any other answer than that. But even in that, I realized an invitation. And this is one of the essential components of spirituality. The invitation was to shut up, not to define the experience, not to define who God is, not to define what it is or what it means or what you should think, but just to have the courage to be. Nothing more. The next experience and the last experience that I'll share with you, and these all happened within a period of 4 or 5, 6 months, I guess, was the experience of 9/11. And in that experience, we all have different memories of that. But one of the memories that I had of it that was profound was the Sunday after 9/11, going into the church and trying to preach. And all the eyes of the people looking at you, saying, "Tell me something. What does this mean? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to think?" And at that moment, being completely and totally aware of the fact that I had nothing to say. That doesn't mean I didn't have a homily prepared. I did. It doesn't mean that I couldn't have sprouted out all sorts of stuff. I could. But faced with that experience and that need and that hunger, I had nothing to say. I should have just sat down. It would have been better if I did. But I stumbled through something. But nonetheless, it was important. And again, as I mentioned to you at the beginning of our short time together this morning, I was blessed to have good teachers in my life. And at this moment of all those encounters, I had an excellent teacher that I could call upon for direction. And his name was Father Pat Hawk. He was a Redemptorist, passed away a few years ago. And Father Pat Hawk was a man of very few words. But the words that he would choose to share with you were always important, always life-giving, always inviting. And I went to him and I shared with him some of these events and his experiences. And he just looked at me and he said, "Well, you know, Tom," he said, "you've spent all your life up to this point running away." He said, "But God got you." I remember saying to myself, how much more could I be got? I've been a priest for 25 years. I've done all this stuff I'm supposed to do. I'm pretty faithful. I've worked my butt off. How can you say that God finally got me? But the truth of that began to sink in, and I realized again how true that Satan was and what he really, really meant. During our conversation together, and I hope as I shared with you this morning some of those things, I hope you begin to understand that when we're talking about spirituality, We're talking about coming to an awareness of something, someone, some experience bigger than yourself, much bigger than yourself, that invites you into a completely different reality. And if you have the courage to enter into that reality when the invitation is given to you, wonderful things happen. And as we gather together over the next few days, let's talk about some of those wonderful things. In your comments that you give me this morning, please let me know if this is what you were expecting. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. If you want any specific direction, suggest that as a way to go. Like I said, it is a conversation. And even though I did all the talking this morning, I can see that there is, in fact, responses. So that's a good thing. And let's continue on. And with God's grace and God's blessing, I'll see you tomorrow morning at 10:15. God bless.